The sun was sinking behind the ragged Arizona mesas when Jonathan Hale first realized something was wrong, because the desert had suddenly fallen silent. No cicadas, no wind against the yucca stalks, no distant cry of a hawk, only a crushing stillness that pressed against his chest like a warning from heaven itself. And as he stood on the porch of his small homestead, hand resting against the weathered railing he had carved himself years ago, more riders than he could count from this distance, coming over the ridge like a slow-moving tide of dust, sunlight glinting off their weapons and feathers, the thunder of their horses rolling beneath them like an approaching storm. He swallowed hard because he knew exactly why they were coming, though he had prayed in the quiet of the previous nights that perhaps the spirits had forgotten, that perhaps the consequences of his actions weeks earlier would fade into the winds. But deep down he understood that nothing involving the Apache ever faded. Their memories were long, and their debts, whether of vengeance or gratitude, were carved into stone. He whispered a soft curse under his breath and stepped off the porch, boots crunching against the dry earth, because he knew running was pointless. The Apache could track a ghost across bare rock, and besides, he had no reason to flee, not after everything that had happened, not after the choice he had made on that fateful summer evening that brought him face to face with the daughters of Chief Dakota, the most respected and feared leader of the White Mountain Apache. He remembered it vividly, every detail burned into his mind like a brand. He had been riding home from the trading post with nothing but flour, salt, a spool of thread, and a tin of coffee when he heard the distant whistle of panic, a sound unlike anything he'd heard in the desert before. And as he neared the canyon split, he saw two young women struggling against the steep side of the ravine, clinging desperately as the ledge beneath them crumbled grain by grain, without thinking, truly without a single thought except that he could not stand there and watch them die. Jonathan had tied off his horse, scrambled down the jagged rock face, and extended a branch toward the nearest girl, her dark eyes wide with terror, her fingers trembling as they reached for salvation. And although the branch snapped halfway through the rescue, he lunged forward in time to grab her wrist, pulling with every ounce of strength he possessed until she collapsed against him, sobbing with fear and relief. The second girl had been harder to reach. The ledge beneath her feet had already given way, leaving her suspended by a thin root that threatened to rip free at any moment. But Jonathan had climbed lower, bracing himself against the sharp outcrop digging into his ribs, and when she finally lost her grip, he caught her, barely her entire weight jerking his arm downward in a flash of blinding pain. But he held on, teeth gritted, and hauled her to safety. It was only after he had brought them to stable ground, breath ragged and shirt drenched with sweat, that he realized who they were, because their necklaces bore the carved crest of Chief Dakota's family, the Thunderbird, symbol of the chief's lineage. And Jonathan understood instantly that he had intervened in something far larger than a simple accident. The girls thanked him between tears, bowing their heads in gratitude, promising that the Apache never forgot a good deed. But Jonathan knew the complexities of tribal politics. He had lived near their territory long enough to understand that helping the chief's daughters wasn't just a noble act, it was a dangerous one, because even good intentions could be twisted, misinterpreted, or exploited. And now, weeks later, as the massive Apache patrol surrounded his house with silent precision, circling like wolves around a campfire, he wondered which interpretation had taken hold, gratitude or suspicion. The dust swirled around him as the riders slowed, forming a wide ring around the homestead, every pair of eyes fixed on him, unreadable, unwavering. Jonathan forced himself to stand tall, though his heart was pounding against his ribs like a drum. And when the riders finally parted to allow a single figure through, his breath caught in his throat, because it was Chief Dakota himself, towering, dignified, his face marked with the solemn symbols of leadership and grief, his black hair braided with eagle feathers that swayed gently in the low wind. The chief dismounted slowly, deliberately, each movement measured like a ritual, and approached Jonathan with the quiet power of a man accustomed to being feared and obeyed. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but Dakota raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The air felt too thick to breathe as the chief stared at him for a long, unbroken moment, Finally, Dakota said, in a voice deep and steady, "My daughters live because of you." Jonathan nodded, uncertain where this was going. "I only did what anyone would do," he replied, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Plenty of men would have ridden past, unwilling to risk their necks. The chief stepped closer until they were only a few feet apart. "No," Dakota said. "You did what a brave man does." The Apache warriors shifted slightly. At those words, not a threat, but a recognition of respect, and Jonathan felt the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. But then Dakota continued, "A debt like this cannot be ignored. A favor like this cannot be left unanswered. The spirits demand balance." As those words echoed across the desert, Jonathan felt a chill race down his spine. Whether the balance the chief spoke of was a blessing or a burden, he could not yet tell. Came next would reshape his life in ways he could never imagine. To everyone watching this story, he thought silently in the style of countless tales shared around fires and on screens. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter will change everything. Jonathan stood frozen as the desert shadows stretched long and thin across the hard-packed earth, and the Apache patrol remained in their perfect circle around his homestead, unmoving, silent, their horses breathing slow and steady like they were part of some living wall. And even the breeze seemed to hesitate, as Chief Dakota's words settled into the cooling air, heavy with meaning and consequence, peace, betrayal, and brotherhood, eyes that carried in them the weight of generations. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was low but carried with it a power that could have commanded the wind itself to still. "When a man saves the blood of a chief," Dakota said, "he becomes bound to that blood. You did not merely save my daughters. Lives you altered. The path of my people." Jonathan felt the words dig into him like hooks. He hadn't thought beyond the immediate moment of saving those girls, hadn't considered how the tribe might perceive it, how the balance of alliances, rivalries, and spiritual omens might shift because of what he had done. He had simply acted on instinct, on a human impulse to protect. But now the chief spoke as though Jonathan had stepped into an ancient ritual he hadn't known he was part of. Dakota raised a hand, and the patrol parted again, just enough for two young women to step forward. The girls Jonathan had rescued, both dressed in ceremonial garments of woven red and black patterns, adorned with beads that shimmered in the dying light. They approached slowly, reverently, heads bowed, and Jonathan's heart tightened at the sight of them, alive, strong, and whole. "This is the man," one of them said softly, and the other nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, though she held her composure with the dignity of her lineage. "He saved us when the earth tried to swallow us," the younger added. Then she stepped forward, surprising Jonathan as she reached out and placed a hand over his heart, a gesture he recognized from observing Apache rituals. It symbolized truth, loyalty, and spiritual acknowledgement. The warriors murmured among themselves, the sound like leaves rustling before a storm. But Dakota silenced them with a single glance. "Jonathan Hale," the chief said, "our tribe has a tradition older than the stones in these canyons. When a man performs a life-saving deed of great sacrifice, he is to be protected by us as one of us." Jonathan blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. "Protected?" he repeated. Dakota nodded. "You have earned the right to stand under our shield. From this day, no one may spill your blood without spilling ours." The weight of those words slammed into for fifths Jonathan like a blow. He had heard of this before. Rumors whispered in frontier towns, men protected fiercely until death. Some of those stories ended in prosperity, others ended in tragedy, because being bound to a tribe as formidable as the Apache meant stepping into battles you did not choose. "Why tell me this now?" Jonathan asked, though fear curled in his stomach like smoke from a dying fire. Dakota's expression darkened, and for the first time, "Because," the chief said, turning his gaze toward the darkening horizon, "there are others who know what you did for my daughters, others who believe your actions mean you are now tied to my bloodline, and not all who watch these lands wish peace for my family." Jonathan understood. Immediately saving the chief's daughters had made him not just a hero, but a potential symbol, a target, a pawn in conflicts he had never known existed. "Who?" Jonathan asked, voice tight. Dakota's jaw flexed. "We're seekers," rival bands, traitors among my people who see your survival as a threat to the future they desire. If they cannot hurt me, they may try to hurt what I owe. The circle of riders tightened subtly, and the intensity of their silent vigilance grew. Tonight, Dakota continued, you come with us, not as a prisoner, but under our protection. My daughters' lives are tied to yours. You saved their breath. Now we must safeguard yours. Jonathan hesitated, glancing back toward his small house, his home, his solitude, everything he had built with his own hands. If I refuse? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The chief looked at him steadily. Then their enemies will come. They will burn your home. They will take your life, and they will say the spirits allowed it. The desert wind gusted then, as if affirming the warning, rattling the wooden slats of Jonathan's porch and sending a swirl of dust dancing around his boots. The girls watched him with pleading eyes, not demanding, not forcing, but silently begging him to accept the protection he had earned with his courage. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against him. I'll go, he said finally, because he knew that survival, honor, and decency all pointed to the same path. Dakota nodded with solemn approval. Then mount, he said. Tonight we ride to the fire summit. The council must hear what has happened. They must witness the man who has altered the fate of our people. Jonathan retrieved his horse, his hands trembling slightly as he took the reins, and when he swung into the saddle, the Apache warriors shifted, adjusting their formation to include him, a living symbol of acceptance, of protection. The chief's daughters rode at his sides, and Jonathan could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the rising dusk. As the massive patrol began moving across the desert, hooves pounding in unified rhythm under the rising moon, Jonathan felt the fragile line of his former life slipping away behind him, replaced by something vast and ancient and incredibly dangerous. Whatever awaited him at the fire summit, whatever judgments, alliances, or threats, he knew it would test him more deeply than the canyon had. And as the patrol thundered toward the distant glow of the Apache campfires, forces that would pull him into war, destiny, and the heart of a tribe whose fate was now forever tied to his. And if you want to know how this journey unfolds, Jonathan thought, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next part will decide who survives the fire ahead.